Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for your interest. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting, the Eora, meaning the people of this place. So, truth in history. There are so many facets to this topic that we could talk about. We could talk about religious history, military and political history, scientific discoveries, in inverted commas, in the law, media. But of course today I've chosen to talk about Australian colonial history due to my research in this book, which covers the first few years of the colony in Sydney Cove. And in the next 40 minutes, of course, we'll only scratch the surface of truth in history. First though, I'd like to look at the topic more generally and to provide some examples which illustrate how we can edge closer to truth in history. Last month, I was in Canberra visiting family, and I sought out a particular monument which made direct reference not only to the words "the truth," but to the truth that will set us all free. Quite a promise. I wanted to see this monument because it had been mentioned in an article I'd read by this Untitled, "The Truth That Will Set Us All Free." The monument is in an avenue in Canberra between the National Library, and the Portrait Gallery. And the monument I was interested in is the rusty-coloured one on the left there, and I was interested in it because I'm going to use what's on this monument to just illustrate different ways in which truth in history can be represented. So that's the actual monument, and the place is called Reconciliation Place. Now, it's talking about the stolen generations. That's not the focus of my talk, but as I said, I want to use it to sort of illustrate some other points in the talk. So, as you can see on here, there are a number of individual inscriptions, but there's one particular one that was mentioned in this article that I read, and this is what it says. "We, the removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children of Australia, would urge you to look through our eyes and walk in our footsteps, to be able to understand our pain. We call on all Australians to acknowledge the truth of our history, to enable us to move forward together on our journey of healing, because it is only the truth that will set us all free." Now, the article that I'd read was by Peter Reid, the leader in Aboriginal history. Soon after he, in the article, referred to this, he said that, more or less, that history comes in different guises. What I wanted to point out was on here it says that we urge you to look through our eyes and walk in our footsteps. So not just one viewpoint. So if we have a look at some of the different inscriptions, and I'll read them out for the podcast. It says, the first one says, "The nuns and fathers at Beagle Bay were good to us. We learnt at school there. We worked in the gardens and there was plenty of food. But my mother's heart was broken, and soon after she was committed to Claremont Mental Hospital where she died." Another quote, "I remember this woman saying to me, 'Your mother's dead. That's why you're here with us.' 2 years after that, my mother and her sister came to the bungalow, but they weren't allowed to visit us because they were black." Another one, "We were all happy together, us kids. We had 2 wonderful old ladies that looked after us." And a final one, "To me, they were children, that's that. I never thought about what colour their skin was. They were there for me to mother, and it had to be mothering, not just caring." So we see different varied experiences there. Now, the words that Peter Reid, Professor Reid said, he said, yes, but truth changes from generation to generation, and the truth is contested in any generation. So one of the points I want to make from this is that truth about a past event or episode is rarely single-sided, but comes in multiple versions. Now, this year, 2014, we celebrate the 100th anniversary, or commemorate, I should say, rather than celebrate, the 100th anniversary of World War I, increasing publication and discussion on the topic, of course. But depending on where we come from geographically, the truth about that particular topic will look different. Various national perspectives and so on. Heroes and villains, resistors and liberators will come in different guises, depending on circumstance and the time. So, as we explore truth in history, first of all we need to define what truth and history are, because I think truth can be elusive. So, if we look up dictionary synonyms of the word truth, we get things like reality, certainty, accuracy, fact. But I thought a simplified definition is worth looking at. This is a simplified version. So it's more the example I was looking at. An example of truth is someone giving their real age. So that sort of takes the complexity out of it. But of course, grammatically, the word truth is an abstract noun. So it's not something tangible, not something we can put on a shelf, but it's a concept, and a complex one. We all know the expression fair dinkum, don't we? The Australian expression. That means to be honest, genuine or true. And I don't know if you noticed, but I noticed that on the news, politicians use that expression a lot, but it's usually in relation to what the other party or the other people should do, if they were fair dinkum about this and so on. So another reference to truth. In researching this topic, I came across a talk delivered almost exactly 100 years ago by exactly the same title, Truth in History. And it was given by an American historian, Professor William Dunning. And in his talk, he referred to a famous conversation about truth that took place 2,000 years ago. And it was one of the most famous conversations ever held at the trial of Jesus Christ and between him and Pontius Pilate. And that conversation ended with the question, what is truth? This is quoting from Professor Dunning's article and the talk that he gave. Pilate saith unto him, what is truth? Thus ends the report of one of the most famous conversations ever recorded. The fact that the conversation terminated without an answer to the question must always raise regret in the mind of the reader and writer of history. For we are told that history has truth as its subject matter and the discovery of truth as its end. An authoritative definition of truth, therefore, would have been a priceless boon. Now, the historian goes on in his talk to suggest that Pilate was asking a rhetorical question, only to affirm the hopelessness of ever reaching a definition. But Professor Dunning went on to say, with a bit more optimism, but the pursuit of an end, meaning truth, is as important as its attainment. And obviously we're all here today because we found that topic, truth in history, very interesting. But as I said, it can be elusive. I'd like to give an example, before we go to Australian colonial history, an example of a globally accepted truth, this was a scientific truth, that proved not to be so. I don't know if people remember the Piltdown Man. So the Piltdown Man, and this is a painting called Piltdown Gang, scientists. In 1912, the Piltdown Man made headlines. Fossil fragments had been unearthed and pieced together to provide the evolutionary missing link between apes and humans. For decades, this momentous discovery influenced research into human evolution. Now it is known to have been a hoax. So how did that happen? Well, the reconstruction of our so-called ancestor came from fragments of the jawbone of an orangutan, small part of the jawbone, and the parts of the cranium of a modern human. Yet it was heralded and taught for more than 40 years as a fact. Okay, how did such a remarkable mistake occur, and how was the truth finally reached? Well, during the decades following the original 1912 announcement of Piltdown Man, increasing numbers of human fossils were discovered, but none showed the large brain and the ape-like jaw of the Piltdown Man. And as the discrepancies increased and new technology emerged, investigations into the fossils began again. So in the late 40s, scientists began to look at and retest the fossils of the Piltdown Man more stringently. Their results proved that the skull and the jaw fragments came from two different species, a human and an ape. Now, interestingly, scratches on the surface of the teeth, which were only visible under a microscope, revealed that the teeth had been filed down to make them look human. They also discovered that most of the fragments from the Piltdown site had been artificially stained to match the local gravel where they had supposedly been found. The conclusion was, of course, that the Piltdown Man was an audacious fake and a sophisticated scientific fraud. So what does this highlight? And if you're interested in looking into this a bit more, you can look on the Natural History Museum site, London. What does it highlight? Well, that in the quest for truth, we have to continually challenge and ask questions about accepted truths. This was a scientific truth for 40 years, and of course it's not isolated. We have to keep checking and keep asking questions. And I'll come back to this picture to illustrate something else. But coming to the word history, the Macquarie Dictionary says that it's a branch of knowledge dealing with past events and the record of past events, especially in connection with humans or human race. But I'm more interested in the root meaning, the etymology. It comes originally from Greek, and it originally meant a learning or knowing by inquiry, and also narrative. So, history in practice, though, is the reconstruction and the interpretation of past events. And it's the official interpretation of history that's taught in schools. The official version that's passed on to us is the one that suits the decision makers and the caretakers of history. So it is important, of course, to ask questions of the different versions of history, because we know that it has been reconstructed for propaganda purposes. So that learning or knowing by inquiry is extremely important. Now, because I'm the author of a recently published book entitled Across Great Divides, True Stories of Life at Sydney Cove, today I want to focus on the representation of truth in history as a writer and a reader of history, and particularly Australian history. My intention in reading or researching and writing Across Great Divides was to go back to the original documents, the journals, the letters, the reports, and bring to life the stories of the First Fleet participants, the men, the women and the children and their military guardians, and also the perspective of the Aboriginal people who watched them come ashore to begin a new phase in Australian history. I wanted to stick to the truth, their version of events, by using their words, the actual words or the reported words of those who were there. As far as filling in the unspoken and unwritten bits, I will come to that later. Now, in the past, the big events, the discoveries, the victories for empire, the people at the helm, the world wars and so on, were taught, I think you'll agree, as a list of facts to be memorised for exams. So, for example, if I said the 1066, what comes to your mind? Battle of Hastings, that's right. But I don't know about you, I don't know much more about that, except that 1066, Battle of Hastings, yeah. Now, when I went to school, what I remember learning about the First Fleet is that in 1788, 11 ships came under the Arthur Phillip. That's about it. Fortunately now, I don't know if you know much about the Australian curriculum now, but I'll just very briefly just go over. In Year 4, students learn about first contacts. They learn about stories of the First Fleet, the reason for their journey and their experiences, and the nature of contact between the Aboriginal people and its effects. In Year 5, they learn, one of the questions is, what do we know about the lives of people in Australia's colonial past, and how do we know? Year 9, they talk about the making of the modern world, and again, there is some electives where they can talk about the convicts and free settlers, about their journey, reactions on arrival, and so on. So, given this emphasis on social history, and given that the mass media and technology gives the capacity to bring history to life on the big screen, for example, there's been a string of books, fiction and non-fiction, and movies aiming to depict historical events in a more engaging and entertaining way. Now that in turn has given rise to broader interpretations of historical events, which bring questions of truth and integrity into question. So, how important is the truth in history? Is it more important to stick to the bare facts? We have a date, we have an event, let's just stick to that. Or is it okay to embellish history, to make it more appealing, more popular, even if it diverges somewhat from the fact? Is engagement with history and a response to history more important than knowing the facts? And the last question, is it possible to have both? To have both an engaging and factual history? Well, I would like to think so, and that's what I aim for in Across Great Divides. Now, history to me is like a jigsaw puzzle, and I'm not the first one to use that analogy. We're still finding and piecing together. So how much of the historical puzzle do we need to know before we can retell it truthfully? So, using the analogy of a jigsaw puzzle, I want you to imagine that the original picture on the lid of the jigsaw puzzle has faded, all right? But undaunted, we begin to reconstruct the puzzle. And as we continue piecing the segments together, we find that nearly half are missing, and realise that the complete picture will most likely be guesswork. So I'm going to go back to this picture of the Piltdown. And in case you don't work it out, the bottom parts of the jigsaw puzzle are missing. Okay. So, what could we tell about that picture without part missing? Those people could have been looking at a cooking demonstration, a card game, or a pile of money. We really, without that part missing, we can't say what that picture was really about. Okay, but if there's only a piece missing here or there, if, for example, the top corner of the wall was missing and the rest was there, it wouldn't really impact on what the picture was about. But if, so say the top of someone's head was missing, all right, that possibly wouldn't make any difference, but it could. Okay, so as I've said, building a historical account is like piecing together a puzzle. And the pieces are the journals, the letters, the documented interviews, newspaper articles, and oral accounts, all taken together to help build the picture. Now, researchers can, of course, draw inaccurate conclusions by just reading and recording what seems to be obvious without taking deeper investigations, without cross-checking other sources and finding out what agrees or contradicts their story. But again, drawing an analogy with piecing together a puzzle, I want you to imagine that if while you were placing the pieces, we begin to decipher a person's hand in the picture. And on that hand, we see a red cuff and a bit of sleeve, all right? Then there's a piece missing. And then we have a red shoulder with a piece of torso with red clothing. What can you reasonably assume about the piece missing? Piece of clothing with a red sleeve? You agree? Reasonably, you can assume that about the missing piece of jigsaw. But what if that piece of clothing had a blue stripe? Is it going to make any difference to the overall story? Probably not. But what if the missing piece later turned out to be a knife wound in that missing piece of jigsaw? That would change the story. So my point is, depending which parts are missing in the overall account of history, we must be careful about jumping to conclusions and embellishing to the degree that it changes the story without the interlocking pieces. Now, using the context of Australian colonial history, I'd like to show some examples of how historical data can become warped by adding something that's not there or by only using some of the evidence. The first example I'm going to use comes from the First Fleet records. It comes from the journal of Arthur Bowes Smythe. He was a surgeon on the Lady Penrhyn. And it's important to mention, before we look at his journal, that he was a man given to overstatement. In his journal, he repeats statements like, "I've never before seen anything like it," continually, those sorts of things. And in this section, he writes about the evening of February the 6th, 1788. And it was the evening when the female convicts of the First Fleet finally landed. Now, the part that's bracketed just there, he says, giving an account, "The men convicts got to them," meaning the female convicts, "very soon after they landed, and it is beyond my abilities to give a just description of the scene of debauchery and riot that ensued during the night." So we have those words, debauchery and riot, okay? Now, from the context, we find out that he's actually not on shore, he's on the boat, right? And he's obviously very fearful of a terrible storm that's making trees blow apart and so on shore. And he's fearful that the ship will get struck. So he's in fear, the sailors are all drinking. A little bit further down there, he says that the scene beggars description. Some were swearing, others quarrelling, others singing. Doesn't actually sound like debauchery, does it? Swearing, singing and quarrelling. But he was the only one that actually mentions what happened that night. But from those few words, and also what I was going to say was, imagine you were on a boat down at Circular Quay and you could hear people on the shore, you know, shouting and singing and quarrelling. It could sound pretty raunchy, but you're not actually there. So, but given this account, this one account, it's gone down in the pages of history, in non-fiction books, as scenes of unrestrained and heartless brutality. Australian historian Grace Karskens, the author of The Colony, she suggests that Robert Hughes the author of the Fatal Shore, might have been the initiator of the modern version of what she calls the legend of Australia's foundational orgy. Now, in Robert Hughes's portrayal, he writes, and I'm quoting, "Couples rutted between the rocks, their clothes slimy with red clay," unquote. Now, in his version, the sex was definitely not consensual, because he goes on to say, "The women floundered to and fro, draggled as muddy chickens under a pump, pursued by male convicts intent on raping them." Now, these scenes have been replicated in other books, and then they flowed onto the movie screen, until the legend has now become accepted truth. Most people, when they think about those early scenes of the women coming ashore, it's full-on, rape scenes. Okay, now, I don't know if any of you know a movie called The Incredible Journey of Mary Bryant, 2005 film. And in the opening title, it says that it's based on true events. And overall, it's a very engaging movie telling the story of Australia's first few years. But it embellishes that particular scene, I believe, to a damaging degree. It depicts scenes of incredible brutality on a mass scale. Women are being knocked to the ground, their clothes are being torn off and viciously raped without any intervention from the onlooking officers. In fact, the movie further embellishes the story by having Governor Phillip blandly looking on with his officers beside him, without any emotion, witnessing the women's ordeal, and amid their screams for help, saying, "We'll let this run its course." Now, that scene does not appear in any known document. It's been added like a piece of a jigsaw that doesn't fit. Now, we say jokingly, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. So, does it matter? Well, what I found disturbing was the portrayal of the guardians of the convict women, in particular Governor Phillip, as an uncaring and irresponsible overseer, to say the least. We've just had the commemoration of the bicentenary of Arthur Phillip's death last month. And we know that though he could mete out harsh judgment, he had shown humanity for the convict women by requesting more clothes than had been allowed them for the First Fleet. He'd also allowed, early in the voyage, he'd allowed for the convicts to be released from their iron fetters and to come up on deck when appropriate. And he'd made allowances for the convict women's tents to be erected before they landed and in a separate section to the males, and to be protected against unwanted visitors. Does it seem likely that he would have allowed the widespread rape and brutal treatment of those in his care? Now, to labour the point, it's reasonable to assume that something happened that night, and Watkin Tench in his journal talks philosophically about the fact that the men and women have been kept apart for 8 months, so something's going to happen type thing. But it wasn't anywhere else recorded on the scale. The mention of debauchery sort of triggered something, and movie makers thought, okay, put a bit of sex into this movie. Now, as a writer, the challenge is to reconstruct the past without replicating errors in secondary sources or jumping to hasty conclusions or preconceived conclusions. And an obvious solution, it seems to me, for narrators of history is to go back to the originals and cross-check. Now, if the originals don't agree, and they often don't, then I think the role of the historian is to present the varying viewpoints, the different sides of the story. So, just going to another example now. Sometimes we can't get to the bottom of an intriguing mystery because the truth's still buried, and we don't have all the pieces yet. Okay, now, the particular incident I'm going to record is centred on a First Fleet convict game shooter named John Mcintyre. And he was fatally speared, it seems deliberately, by an Aboriginal man called Pemulwuy while out on a hunting trip with a sergeant and 2 other convicts. Now, this event is a pivotal moment in Australian colonial history because it triggered strong retaliatory action from Governor Phillip. Yet, the pieces of the puzzle are missing, important pieces, because Mcintyre, on being carried back into Sydney from the bush where he'd been speared, reportedly confessed to crimes of the deepest dye, but then he retracted them. So this is from Watkin Tench's journal, and he says, on the wound being examined by the surgeons, it was pronounced mortal. Now, he knew he was going to die. This man knew that the spear was an execution type spear. The poor wretch now began to utter the most dreadful exclamations and accuse himself of the commissions of crime of the deepest dye, accompanied by such expressions of despair of God's mercy as are too terrible to repeat. Now, that's the frustrating part. They were too terrible to repeat, that we don't know what happened. Yet Governor Phillip, before giving instructions to Watkin Tench for the retaliatory action, said, "This business of Mcintyre, I am fully persuaded that they were unprovoked. For I have separately examined the sergeant, of whose veracity I have the highest opinion, and the two convicts, and their story is short, simple, and alike." Now, Mcintyre did die, and Governor Phillip sent out a punitive mission with Watkin Tench, who was not in complete sync with the severity of the operation as the leader of that punitive expedition. And the account of what did and didn't happen on that tour of duty makes for captivating reading. But to this day, we don't actually know what triggered the whole series of events happening. There were hints that he'd done terrible things to the Aboriginal people, but, too terrible to repeat. And so history is left up in the air. So for a reteller of history, or a documentary maker, it's important that when there are gaps or silences, that they be acknowledged and that allowed to exist. That way the readers can make their own response. If we don't have all the pieces, the truth isn't compromised if we leave the blanks vacant. Now, one final example, before I actually show it to you, it's a painting, and it's depicting an event involving the controversial fourth Governor of New South Wales, Governor Bligh, of the Mutiny on the Bounty fame. Now, Bligh was sent to Australia to restore order in the colony and to sort out a monopoly in trade that had developed by the New South Wales Court, reportedly. So you've probably seen this painting before. Now, and so it's called The Arrest of Governor Bligh. Now, there are various conflicting accounts of the events leading up to the dramatic seizure of the colony's governor and the putting of him under house arrest. So in a narration of the either rebellion or completely justified overtake against Bligh, various accounts of events need to be considered. The Hawkesbury settlers and farmers admired Bligh, and they sent him a petition of support and appreciation. But many in the New South Wales court hated him and built a case against him to justify their actions. This painting is a historical reconstruction of an event by someone with a vested interest in how the situation was portrayed. For example, Bligh being dragged from his hiding place under a bed and portrayed as a coward after Marines had forced their way into Government House to seize him, of course in order to protect the citizens of the colony from his tyranny. Now, in the second book in my series, the Great Divide series, I'll be recounting the Bligh period because it's a very important episode in Australian history. So it will be essential to go to a range of original sources and to show the differing viewpoints. You can buy whole books on, one side of this story, but I think it's important to show all the different sides of the story. And then hopefully the readers will want to dig more and find out what happened. Remember, the original Greek root of the word history means narrative as well as learning or knowing by inquiry. So, revisiting the questions that we started with earlier, what is truth? Well, we've said that truth is an abstract noun. It's a concept, and it's something that needs ongoing scrutiny. How much certainty or evidence do we need to reconstruct or interpret truth in history? Well, ideally, I think we need more than one quote or account on an event or episode in history. We need more than a jawbone to reconstruct skeleton. We need more than one scientific study by a party with vested interest, and more than one artist's impression of a historical scene. So, the answer to me again is obvious, that the more pieces we have and the more varied sources we use to reconstruct an event, the more chance we have of truth in history. Truth can be both elusive, with an I, meaning misleading, and it can also be elusive. It can be intangible and obscure. But as we constantly build pictures of the past, and as we gather more information, the guesswork does diminish. But even then, we need to keep asking questions about versions of the past. Now, I don't know if you've heard of a British historian called Professor Simon Sharma. He spoke last year at a conference in Britain about the changes to the British curriculum. And I love this quote. He says that history is not just a stroll down memory lane. It's not just simply the antique furniture polish that covers our culture. It has to be a living thing. He added, history is storytelling that generates an analytical sensibility and serious, deep, profound questions. So it is storytelling from which question asking is necessarily inseparable. There again we have the reference to the essence of history, which is meaning a narrative and also a process of inquiring. Our current Minister for Education in Australia, Christopher Pyne, in the recent debate about the national curriculum, he said, I want the curriculum to celebrate Australia and for students to know where we've come from as a nation. Because unless we know why we are the kind of nation we are, we can't possibly know where we want to go to in the future. I think that's a reasonable statement. And in order to find out why we are the kind of nation we are, we need to keep asking those questions and from various sources. So writers and movie makers need to keep asking, how do I know that? And students and story lovers, whether they're as readers or moviegoers, need to ask as they read and watch, how do they know that? We need balance too, of course, and I believe the analogy of building and piecing together a jigsaw puzzle demonstrates what I'm trying to convey. We shouldn't recreate episodes of which we have no evidence or little evidence, but the more we have, the more accurately we can reconstruct. So history, like truth, for me, is a never-ending journey. That's what I find so compelling and exciting about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, we've got time for questions.
Okay, does anyone have a question?
Oh, I can put it down.
Oh, you never know.
Right, thank you for that. About a month ago, at the Museum of Sydney, there was a symposium. It was connected with the 200th anniversary of the death of Arthur Phillip.
Yeah, I was there.
Yeah. Right. Well, you'll remember that Grace Karskens mentioned the orgy of the 6th, and she's convinced that it is a myth. Later, Andrew Pink spoke, and he spoke about it as though it is fact. Now, one thing that interested me was nobody mentioned why it was that these convicts, who obviously weren't chained down, didn't run away. Because there'd have been convicts who wanted to run away and those who weren't interested in running away. I don't know which group would have been bigger. However, if it was a free-for-all, as it's supposed to have been, my mind cannot see why some half of the convicts didn't just take off.
Maybe they were more interested in the women. But look, there is only that one account of after those nights. There's only that one account.
Another item I want to approach, this is to do with truth in history. We are celebrating or commemorating the 100th anniversary of the First World War. Now, when it comes to dates, the date of the outbreak of the First World War is a lie, and it is perpetrated and it is repeated. Come September, we are told a lie about the start date of the outbreak of World War II. And this is a comfortable lie.
You'd have to take that up with someone that knows something about this. That's not my. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. That's not my area of expertise.
So what I can gather from, say, that last paragraph there, is that the sort of history telling that, say, Peter Simons or Colin McCullough does, which builds stories around facts, is from your point of view the most appropriate, best way of telling history?
I think look, people love historical fiction, and I read The Lieutenant, Kate Granville's The Lieutenant, and I loved it, but I did keep thinking, but who is, because she changed the names. I mean, I think if you're going to write a book that's called non-fiction, which I have, and I have joined the dots, here and there because we don't know everything that happened. Like I have Watkin Tench sitting on a log as he's watching the Aboriginal people in their canoes. I don't know for sure that he was sitting on a log. But that's why I tried to use the analogy of the puzzle, that obviously some parts we don't know and we shouldn't make that up, you know, the important parts. But if it's a little piece from the top corner that we embellish. So, sorry, I'm not really answering your question. I mean, they're the sort of books I enjoy. Yeah. Books that I trust the author to have done their research and that it's based on fact.
Well, I've read Across Great Divide, and to me that seems to be what style you're trying to take here. It's interesting, it's fact.
Mm.
No, I was just saying, I've read Across Great Divide, and I think that's the sort of approach you've taken. It's interesting, but it's also a fact, and you learn from it as well.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Yes, I've got one here. Yep.
Recently, I've been fortunate enough to read some logbooks, and I was confused by certain people who had a different date for recording. Then I found out that there is a civil date and a nautical date time, and so there was a difference there.
And that's where the research comes in.
Yes, yes.
Knowing that and checking that.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, if somebody has written a book like you have, and I haven't read your book, and you know for sure that it is so wrong, and yet year after year, centuries pass, and it's, you know, it's not brought out.
Yeah.
I went to university late and learned a lot about Australian social history. It was such an eye-opener, especially for women in Australia. It was such an eye-opener. And, you know, Christopher Pyne might have this pie in the sky idea of real Australian history, but he's way off, way off. He has absolutely no idea of presenting to children today the real facts. I think we should, as people interested in history, we've got to find a way of pointing out, look, this is incorrect. Let's teach our children the correct history.
And it is a continual. As I said, it
goes on and on.
Yeah, it is a continual. You know, new information is coming forward all the time. They're finding, well, Christine recently unearthed. Now we know one of the convicts that accompanied Waxon Wentworth and Wilson over the mountains. For years, we didn't know who they were. The information's coming out about Bennelong. You know, the story is that Bennelong, when he came back from England, basically degenerated into a drunkard and died, you know, in disgrace. But we're finding out now that that's not true. He actually went on to live, he did drink, but so did everybody else in the colony. He lived a very constructive life and died as a highly admired man of his community. So I think those are the sort of stories that need to be brought out more, you know, all of them, really.
There's a question down the end.
I think the issue is some of the modern books like Peter Fitzsimon's, you hope that the basic points of the compass are covered in accuracy, but all the rest is nobody was there, or that people were there but they didn't see everything, so it's made up. But it's a bit like when you hear of a movie based on fact. You know it's nowhere near fact, and then you see the events have been changed, everything like that.
And that is a worry, isn't it?
I was just thinking about truth, and it struck me that probably the best modern example of accuracy is Hugh Trevor Roper's book, he's dead now, famous historian, about the last days in Hitler's bunker. He was given the job by the British Army to find out what happened because the Russians were making up stories. So he did all the research and then published a book on the last days. Now that went into about 10 editions, and the last one was in 1995, I think, and it's still the most accurate version of what happened. And that's probably the gold standard for modern historical research. For example, I just found Borman's body about 10 years ago when they were renovating some buildings, and that's exactly what he said had happened. and that's the gold standard. He went and interviewed all the people he could to find out what actually happened. I think that's the gold standard for historical truth.
But that's not to say that maybe later on something will be found.
Yeah,
that,
but it's probably minor because he's covered all the bases.
Yeah.
There's one other thing was that when you were talking about the word truth, you gave the example of someone giving their age.
Yeah, that was just meant to be funny, really.
Right. Because when one talks to Koreans, they can have 3 birthdays in the 1 year.
Yeah.
And you try to find out from them just what they're on about, and they talk in circles, and by the time they're finished, who knows?
Yeah, that's
And
right. Well, the truth is elusive.
and as for the subject of Hitler, his diaries were found very conveniently on the 50th anniversary of him coming to power. And it was people, I think Hugh Trevor Roper was involved in authenticating it. A whole list of eminent people authenticated it, and then it turned out to be a hoax. So even Hugh Trevor Roper is compromised.
I think I'm a bit of a postmodernist on history, and I go back to Pontius Pilate. Because in my industry, I see the way that people write history. As you say, you've got the official history. I think there may be a handful of academics who write to each other, and they're largely irrelevant, and they're unreadable in their history, so I'm going to look forward to reading your book. But generally speaking, it's what Brown said about Smith in relation to Jones, and they just talk to each other. Simon Schama, let me just say, is a brilliant example about being a good historian. But meanwhile, for the 99% of the rest of humanity, we tend to follow whatever is the official line. And I think that we're coming to an era where people are increasingly superficial and they don't ask questions. Because we're in a click, most of us in this room are fairly old, and so we are still in the business of reading books. I've got students who just click and flick, and they don't linger for very long on any web page, but they've got pancake minds, brilliantly spread across, but very shallow.
Well, I've had other history lecturers say the same thing, that young people are not as interested in reading history, but that's where I think we have to have the balance, because it does have to be engaging. If they're not interested in knowing a list of dates and just what happened, and but if you look at the Australian curriculum now, I mean, they are encouraged to ask questions. What do we know about the settlement, the lives of the convicts, and how do we know? I mean, I think that's brilliant. And just getting back to what I tried to do with the Cross Great Divides, I could have put references all the way through it. It would have looked quite academic, but I thought, then you're preaching to the converted, to people that are already interested in history. So what I tried to do was make it read like a narrative, and if people want to know how I know that, they can go to references in the back. So I think it's like, you've got to keep that balance between, keeping it, these are the facts, this is what happened, but also making it interesting and engaging, and the stories. And believe me, I mean, I probably am preaching to the converted here, but the stories of the convicts, the interaction with the Aboriginal people, and what happened in their lives is absolutely fascinating. We don't need to write fiction. We don't. The facts are interesting.
Talking about your book, how do you know, or how do we know, what the Aboriginals were thinking because of the language barrier?
Okay. When I first started writing the book, it was about the convicts and about the white perspective, the white people coming ashore. The more research I did, I realised we actually know a lot about what happened with the Aboriginal people. There was a lot of curiosity. So we had people like William Dawes. I don't know if you know about William Dawes. He kept a language journal, which a lot of these things have only been uncovered over the last few decades. And he probably had about 20 Aboriginal people who visited him down at what's still called Dawes Point. He had an observatory, and he kept a journal of conversations and so on. And they weren't just a list of words, they were actual conversations. So we know that, he interacted with them. Watkin Tench also kept, he had a lot of communication with the Aboriginal people. They weren't just observations. When he finished his journal, he was leaving to go back to Britain, he said, I can count many of these people as my friends. You know, there was also David Collins, Governor Secretary. And then we also have, later on, people like Marut, who was termed the last Aborigine of the Botany Bay tribe. He was interviewed for an inquiry into the Aboriginal people and their conditions, and he was talking about the generation before him. His parents said what happened, what they thought when they saw the boats coming in. You know, we thought they were floating islands and so on. So we have a lot of information about what the Aboriginal people thought and about the white people and so on.
Well, if there are no other questions, please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you.